Well, hello, everyone. Thank you for coming today and welcome to our next conversation on implementing the state's cumulative impact law. My name is Darren Broughton. I'm the senior advisor to the commissioner, as well as our director of external affairs here at the MPCA. For today's conversation, we're going to walk through the findings and major themes that the agency heard during our open comment period that was this summer and into early fall. And just as important, we're going to spend a little bit of time here kind of walking through how we see the next 6 to 9 months in this long journey that we have to developing rules and regulations for implementing the state's new cumulative impact law. I'll turn it over here to Hassan for a second, here in a second, to walk us through the findings and that schedule. We have a full team here today from MPCA. Again, I just want to remind folks that this video or today's conversation is being recorded, so you all know that, and we'll make that available after today's conversation is done. And if you have questions, you can put them in the chat and we'll get to them as soon as we walk through the findings and next steps, or you can also raise your hand as well, and we will get to them as soon as possible. But I think we have about an hour or so for today's conversation. We'll use as much time as we need to answer folks' questions and any other additional insights that folks have for the agency as we move forward. With that, I will pass it over to Hassan.
Thanks, Darren. Hi, everybody. My name is Hassan Boucherab. I'm an engineer in our air policy unit here at the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, and one of the numerous folks from PCA working on this rule. So what I'm going to quickly, Darren did a good job summarizing it, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to pull up a couple of slides, walk through kind of what we've heard from the comments so far, and then just kind of have that discussion that comes with sharing what we've seen so far. We're still in the process, obviously, of looking at all of these things that you all told us about, but we'd like to share sort of kind of what we've seen so far, some of those initial reactions, and go from there. So I'm going to pull up that presentation here quickly. And I believe you should all be seeing the slides now. If not, somebody let me know. But anyway, so again, here we are today. We're going to talk a little bit about the comments that we received during the official request for comment period. We heard from a lot of you, and kind of what we'll talk about today is just a little bit of helpful background. I wanted to start with, if you're not familiar with the rulemaking process, I wanted to cover that briefly. We have some updates to share with you regarding environmental justice maps. We'll go through the comment summary and kind of intersperse through there. It's not its own thing, but we'll talk sort of initial questions and reactions. And then, like Darren mentioned, we'll briefly talk through what we think some of the next steps look like here for the next 6 to 9 months. So again, feel free if you want to write down your questions, your comments in the chat. We'll try and get to those as soon as we end. If you want to ask your question specifically, raise your hand. We'll get to you when we're done. If you're looking for the raise hand button, it's under reactions. So we'll get there and hope to have a good conversation today. So if you weren't aware, one of the places where you can go find a lot of this information, we have a proposed rules webpage. This is all of the rules that the agency is working on, not just air, not just this cumulative impacts rule. You'll see all of the projects. You can sign up to receive emails on the rules that you're interested in, or just rulemaking in general. And then you can find the specific page for cumulative impacts there. And if you wanted to see copies of all of the comments that we've received, you can find those in that specific link, or that's also on the webpage itself. So starting with the process, and we'll kind of get through, well, we're in the very early stages of this, right? So we just finished up that request for comment period. Briefly, you can kind of see the blue text, or the brighter blue text is more opportunities for public participation. We had the comment period. This is one of many meetings I imagine we'll be having over the next several months, year, 2.5 years. But it starts with that request for comments. We have to put this out. We have to talk about what are we thinking about doing. We have to announce that we are intending to do a rulemaking. And that's how we got this cumulative impacts process started once the legislature told us, we want you to do this rule. So we'll have a bunch of meetings between now and the end of the 2.5 year time frame that's remaining. But one of the things that will happen from now until the end, when we get to the final rules, is we'll have to draft what those rules look like, and we'll have to create a couple of documents that go along with it. The specific one in particular that I want to draw your attention to is going to be this statement of need and reasonableness, or SONAR. That's going to be where we talk about how we make all of the decisions, what information was considered, how we made all of the final decisions, how we addressed all of the different parts of administrative procedures that we need to do when we do this type of rulemaking. Once we get there, that's where we end up in probably one of the biggest milestones, is that proposed rules. So, or you might also hear this called a notice of intent to adopt. We'll get to that proposed rule stage. We'll have another opportunity for a formal public comment period. We're planning on a public hearing. So again, you can give your comments orally at that meeting. You can comment at that hearing. You can provide more written comments. We'll have more things to look at, more rules and reasoning behind what we chose to do, or what we ended up doing during that time. So that's a lot of the process. It's maybe the first half. We get there, then we get to more that comes later. We'll get to that response to comments. We'll get to something called the order adopting rules. That's when we're in more of the final stages. But after that, there's still more. The governor's office has to review it. We have to go through the Office of Administrative Hearings. They do the final look. They review and either approve or disapprove the rules before we get to that final rule stage. Now, the things I wanted to draw your attention to was this request for comments and this proposed rules, the couple of lines with the couple of asterisks around them. Those are ones where we have specific deadlines that the legislature and Minnesota statutes define for us. So we had to get the request for comments out very quickly. We had 60 days to do that from when the legislature created this rule, or told us to do this rule. And then the deadline that you'll hear us talking about, that 36-month deadline, that roughly 3 years, that's what we have to get to for proposed rules. So we're not going to be done with this whole process in 36 months. That's just where we will get to the proposed rule stage. So I like to cover that just briefly. I think it's helpful. I know people have, if this is old hat to you, well, somebody else might have appreciated it. And so I want to make sure they're coming along too. So specifically now, more on cumulative impacts. We have a couple of very specific general purpose, right? So we're beginning work on this rule. We're addressing Minnesotans' disproportionate exposure to pollutants. We have to do a lot that sort of in this rule was left up to the agency, the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency, to determine. So we have to come up with what are the criteria for when we require a cumulative impact analysis? What does that cumulative impact analysis contain? When we look at what it contains, what defines a substantial adverse environmental and health impact? And then if you get there, what comes, what's all the structure, what can go into, what's the process for a community benefits agreement? And alongside all of this data that will eventually go into, or that we figure out has to go into this process, we need to make sure folks have access to that. We need to make sure we have the social and environmental factors, health care, medical care, food, all of these other things that we can potentially or have to potentially think about for this process. We have to make sure that everybody can access that information. So again, we have 36 months. So about now it's been about 6 months so far. So we have about 2.5 years left to get to that notice of intent to adopt or that proposed rule. So we'll get there. And just to remind you, here's like the big picture. If you've come to some of these public meetings we've had previously, this might look a little familiar, but we're making it really clear. This is where we're at right now. We're in this development stage. We're in the process of figuring out what all of this stuff looks like. And now a big part of this is understanding what folks who participate and what folks who are impacted by this rule care about. And that's what you all told us in your comments. So we'll get there, but we still have a ways to go. We're not done. And like we said, we'll get to, at the end of the presentation, we'll get to a little bit more about what we're thinking for the next 6 to 9 months. So one thing I wanted to start with, I thought would be helpful, and in some conversations, folks had recommended this as well, is, well, we have a couple different things. We have what the legislation says and what we have to do in rulemaking. And just so as a quick example, the legislation that authorized this rule and told the PCA to do this rule defines cumulative impacts. And you can see that definition up there in the italicized text. That doesn't, just to point out a few questions, that doesn't say what we have to consider in that cumulative impact analysis. That doesn't say or define how we evaluate cumulative impacts, or what do we compare against? How do we look at the impacts of aggregated levels of past and current air, water, and land pollution? What do we evaluate that against? What do we compare that against? These are all questions that don't have answers right now. And I want to make sure you all know that this is part of the process. We don't have this answer. We're trying to figure out what this looks like, thinking about and looking at what you've all told us as well. However, there's also some areas where the PCA is, and I want to try and be clear, where we have the responsibility to make a choice, or we don't have the option to make a choice here. So as another example, one of those things that the legislation prescribed is, what is the definition of an environmental justice area? We had a couple of comments, a couple of questions in the public meetings earlier. Folks were asking, well, hey, I'm in parts of greater Minnesota. This doesn't look like it affects me, but I care about this too. Absolutely valid question, absolutely valid concern. And on the other side, folks are saying, I think these are too big. This shouldn't include other areas, or doesn't make sense. It would dilute the intent of the program. Again, very valid relevant points here. But this is one area where the PCA is a little more limited in what we can do as part of the rulemaking itself. In some areas, the legislature was very clear on what they intended. In other areas, they said, PCA, essentially go figure it out, come up with what you want to do. So hopefully, as we keep doing some of these meetings, we'll have more background where we try and dig into some of the more particular topics or areas of the rule. So if you have, especially if you have suggestions on things where you might like to see more or have a little bit more background on something in particular, I know that would be helpful to me. So if you have those, you're more than, please feel free and empowered to share those. So to start off with one thing on the topic of environmental justice, a lot of folks had questions, comments about the maps themselves. Just as a quick update, we don't have this just yet, but we did in some of the initial maps that you may have seen previously, we did note, or we did find an error in some of that income data. So specifically, the margin of error was overestimated in a couple of areas. And we're still digging through this, so we don't have a great answer just yet, but what it looks like is this has overestimated some of these areas in the metro by about 10%. So we're working through in fixing that error. We're hoping to have those new maps available in early 2024. We'll post those online and we'll send them out to folks who are subscribed to that Gov delivery list for the rulemaking. So again, just another quick plug, go sign up for those. If you haven't already, they're super helpful in being able to stay connected throughout this process. So on to the comments. We had a really big turnout. I was very happy to see how many folks were interested. We had just the quick rundown. We had about 350 comments total that came in. We had 12 handwritten comments at the public meetings that we held around the state. 22 comments from a variety of groups, either community business or environmental advocacy groups, city or city organizations, facilities themselves, industrial facilities, and then professional organizations too. We had about 26 comments just from individual folks, as far as I could tell, just, here's my name, here's my comment. I'm glad to see that they participated. And we had just under 300 comments that were sent in or sort of collected by 4 different groups that focused on many of the same topics. Some of those letters had unique aspects that folks added in, and so we've tried to capture those as well. But for a lot of those, they covered very much the same topics, or they specifically noted a few things in particular. And so overall, what we saw and what I saw in this request for comments is an emphasis in a handful of areas, specifically telling us, hey, you should really make sure you do more and continue doing more on outreach and engagement throughout this rulemaking. Make sure you're addressing accessibility and transparency and talking about all of these things and looking at all of these different parts of the rule. And then eventually, when we get to farther down the process, make sure that there's clear guidelines, explanation, whatever the decision is that was made, make sure it's understandable, it's able to be understood by those who are interested. We had a bunch of suggestions, and I'm not going to be able to cover all 350 comments, so I'm just giving you a smattering. This is some of the ones that kind of, stood out to me. We had a bunch of suggestions on benchmarks for when we should require this cumulative impact analysis. We had many suggestions on the things that we should include in that analysis itself. So whether it's health conditions or different types of pollution or socioeconomic conditions, a whole bunch of things that folks put together and sent our way. We had a bunch on what is that substantial adverse impact, and then what should surround the community benefit agreement. What's that process look like? Who should be involved? How do you go about that whole creation of that community benefit agreement? So what I wanted to do next was talk through, we asked in the request for comments 8 general areas. We didn't limit it to that, and many of you told us a bunch of things that were not necessarily in those areas. But so I want to cover sort of those 8 areas in particular, and then I wanted to highlight a couple of things here at the start. So some of the unique things, again, just a smattering that stood out to me. What happens surrounding a community benefit agreement? What happens if that's not being honored, if it's not being followed? A few folks put forward an idea of, well, we should have the ability to challenge or amend those agreements if it's not working. A couple folks pointed out, well, hey, what about facilities outside of Minnesota? Maybe you can't necessarily as a state regulate facilities in Wisconsin, but it sure makes sense that you should be able to understand the impacts. Like if there's something in Superior and you're in Duluth, it's close enough. So how do you consider impacts of facilities outside of Minnesota? Again, folks pointed out, hey, we should expand this to all parts of Minnesota. Other folks pointed out it should be smaller. So again, pretty common topic there. Lots of interest in sort of where this is ultimately applicable. And then a couple other ones just to highlight is some folks started pointing out, well, what happens? How do you start considering climate change as part of this program? How do you think about that in a cumulative impacts? Does that change things as time goes on and as things change? And I think one that in particular rang true for a lot of people was, really we should emphasize the need to protect children and those most vulnerable. So who are the people that are being potentially most impacted, and amongst those people, making sure we're trying to protect those most vulnerable. So one of those first areas on benchmark. So what do we do? How do we figure out what's the need? What's the bar for requiring a cumulative impact analysis? Few commenters said we should really address, this is an issue of race and systemic racism. So make sure you're addressing that from the outset. And again, I'm just going through all of these. This is just the topics that I'm summarizing that you all told us. You should include health outcomes, socioeconomic conditions as benchmarks. They should be clear or quantifiable. A couple of things focused on, what might you use? Do you look at the amount of air pollution? Do you look at emissions that, a facility is generating? Do you look at monitoring data around those areas? Do we create something like a unique metrics? Do we do an air pollution score as sort of a way to collect all of the different ways that something might interact with people or with the environment? Do we have separate criteria? Do we have separate criteria for the type of permit? Is it a new permit? Is it a permit that's being reissued or renewed? Is it different for if the permit is being modified? And as an example, as a callback to that last slide, do we have separate criteria for children, for the impact on children, or for the impact on elderly or those most vulnerable? How do we quantify all of these different things? What do we use? Do you do it more of as a comparative look? Is the risk in this location greater than the average for the state or for the county? Do you have different measures if the facility is or if there is historical bad behavior, right? So if there's been something that hasn't gone well, does that influence or make it more likely that a cumulative impact analysis would be required? And then on the other side, is there an off-ramp? Do you always have to look at this for a new permit or a modified permit? But if that permit is reducing emissions, do you still have to do that? Again, none of this has been decided, but these are all just some of the questions and comments that you all told us. So second area, what do we look at in that analysis? Say we get there, again, let's make sure we're addressing race, systemic racism from the outset. Folks provided a couple of suggestions. You can use some external resources. We have the United States Environmental Protection Agency's Environmental Justice Screen Tool, or EJ Screen. Do we look at reports from the Minnesota Department of Health? Do we look at other public health data sets? How does that all wrap into here? Do we look at current negative impacts? Do we look at different biomonitoring data? Can we get, well, one, do we have access to that? Is that able to be used? How do we look at past or current impacts? Do we look at inequities that exist already in public health? And, are we looking at just this facility? Some folks suggested certainly not. Hey, I live in a neighborhood. There's a lot of noisy stuff around me. There's a lot of backyard fires around me, or I live next to something that's particularly smelly. You should include all of these other things in that analysis as well. And a common thing that across a bunch of these different areas is, folks suggested go look at, some other states have done this recently or have done something similar. Can you go look at what New Jersey has done or Colorado has done? Can you base it in a similar manner off of there? And I think that's a really good point for all of these things is, if you have specific experience and you can think of, hey, this worked really well. I used to live in Colorado and they had this program and it's been great. And I felt heard. Absolutely. Let me know that. So, if that's a good model to base something off of, that's really helpful. Or alternatively, if you're like, nope, that was terrible. I didn't like that. What can we learn from that experience that you had elsewhere and try and avoid that same problem moving forward? Some other suggestions here were, you could have this focus of the cumulative impact analysis be more, should that be focused on what the actual facility is proposing to do? So if they're proposing to do something that generates a particular type of pollution, should they only look at that? Should they look at other pollution as well? Should they look at other things that maybe, interact with that pollution? Again, all things that will, again, these are super good questions, super good comments that you all gave us, and is giving us a lot to think about. So now we get into, well, we've done the cumulative impact analysis. We see the outcome in environment or in health. What do we use as, the bar for this is too much, or this is a substantial adverse impact? Again, some suggestions on go look at the inequities that exist in public health, go look at socioeconomic and biomonitoring data, all ways of sort of comparing what do we think the outcome of this particular action of this particular facility is in the area. There were some suggestions of, do you look at this and is a substantial adverse impact only tied to the facility, the contribution from the facility being a disproportionate part of that impact? So, maybe there is some problem, but the facility is only responsible for 10% of that problem by way of looking at it in this analysis. Does that mean something? If that's still a problem, should that be a substantial adverse impact? Is that something that the facility should do? Is that not? When you're looking at this, what's a quote unquote large increase? How do we sort of figure out what is too much? What is that bar that we judge the impacts that we're seeing? And again, another area where folks said, go look at what some other states have done, go look at New Jersey, go look at Colorado, go look at a couple different states. And some suggestions here too on, if this is an impact that affects health, what's the impact on that? So if it's something that affects asthma or respiratory illnesses, does that lead to an increase in those? How much of an increase? What is that increase that is too much? And just comparing to what we see currently. So we are fourth topic now. We've gone through that whole process. We see that there's an impact. We see that there is a substantial adverse impact. Now we're in the realm of looking at a community benefit agreement. We heard a lot here on, community input really needs to come first in these. We need to have that equitable and transparent process. We need to make sure that folks understand the process in decision making, the guidelines that are out there or that might be created as a part of this. Help make sense. Everybody can understand, here's how we are intending to review and kind of make decisions. Again, just to make sure everybody is coming along for the ride at the same time, make sure everybody at least has the ability to understand what it is that we're talking about, so we're not unintentionally leaving somebody behind, because we don't want to do that. We had folks suggest, well, could you do something else? Maybe it's not specifically tied to whatever the facility is doing, but could you reduce other impacts? So can you do something to address noise? Can you do something to address traffic pollution by either reducing or preventing that pollution? Can you, other suggestions included, hey, we should work with this group or, these types of groups in a community, and you should maximize whatever those opportunities that they can create for an area. So a couple of different, this one was, I think, one of the hardest, at least for me, to summarize, because there was a lot of input, a lot of feelings, thoughts on this in particular. A couple others that I wanted to highlight for folks is, this came in a few comments across a few letters. Folks didn't want this to be used to avoid the process. You shouldn't be able to just skip ahead, go to the community benefit agreement and say, all right, we don't have to do the cumulative impact analysis. There's other suggestions of, do you, alternatively, instead of like one of the few other comments say, look at other local impacts, there was another side that said, well, you should limit the terms to whatever the disproportionate impact or exposure is. So if this is impacting, again, asthma, respiratory illnesses as an example, should you only do stuff that's focused on things that would help make asthma, respiratory illnesses less prevalent or address those in some way, shape, or form? And I think the last thing that I wanted to highlight here was specifically, this has to be, or there were some suggestions that this is going to be a hard balancing act between, well, what does the community need? What does the community want? What's practical, achievable? What can actually be done as part of this community benefit agreement? That's a really good question. I don't have a brilliant answer for that right now, but that's something we'll have to think about and be mindful of as we go forward. So getting to the end here, I think for the vast majority of the comments, they focused on some of those 4 first topics. So we didn't get much here just yet on, well, what should go into the petition process? So part of the legislation said, PCA, you have to create a process for residents that say, well, maybe the benchmarks aren't met, but we think you should still do a cumulative impact analysis anyway. So the few comments that folks gave us on that is, maybe this shouldn't be based on just technical evidence. How do you take those lived stories or that more qualitative type impact or type input from folks and have that weigh into a process like this? Great question. Couple other things here is, well, are there timing considerations? When does this petition have to happen? Do you have to have verification of those signatures or of the people who sign those petitions? And then just sort of more, again, I think in that realm of clarity and transparency, what's the process surrounding it? So everybody knows, how be clear not only with the timing of when that petition has to happen, but how PCA plans to review and treat those petitions moving forward and making that decision on, do we need to do a cumulative impact analysis? One part was, again, we had the legislatures told us we have to create a process through tribal consultation that tribal governments in Minnesota can elect to apply these requirements to a permit application in the Indian country, specifically termed in US code. But not much here other than basically folks were saying, yep, we support that. Absolutely. Go talk to tribes, get their input, make sure you're engaging with them throughout this process. Again, not too much on public meetings and public comments. We have to come up with what are those methods? How do we do all of this? What are what's the skeleton of what all of this looks like? Again, generally, folks were supportive across the board for public meetings as a method to share information. There was a suggestion that maybe those public meetings can run in parallel with the technical review. I think part of that is in the statute language itself, but again, good suggestions all around. Lastly, and then I'll hand it over to a colleague of mine to talk through some of the next steps. But this is, again, I think we heard the most about the outreach and engagement process. And it was really just that ringing endorsement of, please be clear, make those guidelines available, make that decision-making process available, make that transparent, make it accessible, and engage, most importantly, engage with people throughout this process. So, that's what we're hoping to accomplish here today in all of these meetings that we've had previously, in some of the things you'll hear about next, about what's the future hold for this. So we'll do our best. If you think there is something that you think we should do or you would like us to do, absolutely let us know. If you have a meeting that you have, if there's like a community organization that you're a part of and you want us to come talk to that organization, let us know, because we can certainly look at that. We can find that time. We can talk to anybody who is interested in talking to us. And it's really important. I just want to stress this, and then I'll let Maggie talk, is I absolutely want you to tell me if you want to talk to us, because I don't know if you want to talk to us unless you let us know. We'll do our best to try and guess at it, but if you tell us, absolutely, we can hear you then. So with that, Maggie is going to talk a little bit about what we're seeing as some of the next steps. So Maggie, whenever you're ready, and let me know and I'll advance the slides.
Thanks. Good afternoon. My name is Maggie Winger. I'm the Rules Unit Supervisor at the Pollution Control Agency. Hassan talked a little bit about the major components of the rule. We've been thinking about that a lot, what's required by statute, what we heard from you. And we wanted to sort of end today with sort of what we're thinking about the next 6 to 9 months. We have until that spring 2026 deadline to publish a draft rule and a notice of intent to adopt, but we're really thinking about 2024 as our time to dig in on those major rule concepts. So all those categories Hassan went through, and before we start writing actual rule text, really hammering out, what do we like about other states' programs? What did people not think worked in those? How do we learn from that? So we're thinking about 2 major pieces for next calendar year. First, kind of starting with some webinars where we're not going to talk. We're going to bring in outside experts, people from environmental groups and environmental justice groups in other states, people from other state governments, outside experts, to sort of talk through, how did New Jersey set their benchmarks? Or how did New Jersey set up how this runs parallel to a regulatory process? Because we want all these outside people to come, we do think these need to be virtual. Just, we can't fly folks in from New Jersey. And so we're going to try to do that. We will record them. We'll make them available. If you have people you think we should include in this, we'd love to hear it. If you have a preference on kind of what topic we start with, we'd love to hear it. For all events, we will follow the 30-day notice requirements that are in the statute. We'll try to give as much notice as we can. We're not able to commit to any 2024 dates today, but we will make sure we let you know through that Gov delivery list and other methods. So that's kind of the first phase. We're saying just to kind of get us all on the same page, hear what has gone well and not gone well other places. So that before we start working on, well, what should it look like in Minnesota, we all have some sort of the same grounding in what has happened. We're not the very first place to ever consider cumulative impacts. So we can learn from what has happened other places. And then going into more work sessions on those concepts, right? So really hearing from you, what would you like this to see conclude? What are good models? What do we not want to carry forward in Minnesota? We are looking for outside facilitation help with this whole process. We'll let you know when we know more, but we understand that because of the role we have in incorporating all the input we get into a final rule, we want somebody there to make sure everybody's heard in the process and that the meetings are working in whatever format we can do. We're open to feedback on all those formats, but we also are trying to balance, this applies in the metro, it applies in Duluth, it applies in Rochester. We want to make sure opportunities work for as many people as we can. Hassan, can you go forward a slide, please? So yeah, we'd love to hear from you about how to make this 2024 rule engagement work. If there's specific topics you want more time on, if you have thoughts on time of day or day of the week, I think something we've also heard many versions of is like, people have a wide range of preferences for how they want to engage, and that totally makes sense. There's a wide range of Minnesotans who are interested in this. We can't make it work we can't make one thing work for everyone. And so partly we want to make sure we're providing options, and that can be like today where we're going to record it. You're always welcome to contact us outside of meetings. But if you have ideas for kind of making it feasible for folks to participate, knowing that, you know, if we go do it in Rochester, it's not that convenient for the metro, and vice versa. And so we're trying to think through all of that. So we'd love feedback on any of those questions. You have Hassan's email. He will get you to someone. You're welcome to email me. And we would really appreciate your feedback on this. Again, we will send any actual dates as soon as we can to the Gov delivery list. I think that's it for the next steps.
So yeah, that's all I had as far as the actual presentation goes. Again, just one last shot from that meeting that we had in St. Paul. So I will close this out for now, and we can go to questions. Did we get any I couldn't see the chat throughout the presentation. So if anybody has questions in the chat, we can start with those first. If you want to ask a question out loud, feel free to raise your hand, and we'll start going through that as we go. So I see Linda asked, if we're attending today, will we be informed via email of next steps in the process? Yes, as far as I know, and Maggie, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think those are going to go out through, or Linda, feel free to jump in here too. Are you asking if you've attended this meeting? Does that mean we have your email and we can contact you that way? Or otherwise, my recommendation would be sign up for that Gov delivery list, and we'll keep things moving that way. And I should have just scrolled down because I saw Anna responded to that just now, and so did Darren. Christina asked, being in Greater Minnesota, does MPCA still want input and engagement from our North Central area? Absolutely. Absolutely, because no one area of Minnesota is the exact same as any other area. You might have a very particular thing that matters to you, that we want to know about, because if it's something that matters for your area, for your location, for your community, maybe that matters for someone else somewhere else too. So absolutely, let us know, because we're trying to design this whole process, right? And so we want this to be the best we can have it, and so we want to understand as much as we can. Betty says, ask for my email. Okay, great. Thank you, Anna. Janet asked, how does this impact current projects like 252? I am not sure I understand that reference.
Janet, to clarify, do you mean the Minnesota Department of Transportation Highway 252 expansion project? Yeah, okay. So the way the statute is written, the projects that would kick off this process would need to have a certain type of air permit. Transportation projects do not get air permits. So in that way, it would not be something that triggers a cumulative impact analysis. Transportation emissions could absolutely inform a cumulative impact analysis in that area, right? So if we have a facility near Interstate 94, Interstate 94 emissions could inform that analysis, but you need an air permit action to initiate the process, given the statutory language.
Right, and that's one of the areas of the legislation that was more specific. That was one of those areas that was the legislature was more specific. This matters when you're going through an air permit process, an air permit application. I see the Frontline Communities group says, we still suggest more basic education on what cumulative impacts are and how these impacts are harming people. I think that's a great suggestion. And that's, I believe, or I know we're at least contemplating that about one of these webinars, and how do we how do we think about all of these things? What is actually a cumulative impact? What does this mean for me in, living where I do? So again, yeah, if you have maybe if you have even more specific suggestions on what you think would be helpful in there, we can certainly try and talk more about that too. I see Steve Sternberg, I think, asks, would the Smith Foundry be a good starter case study? Seems like they are exactly what the legislature was aiming this rule towards. Darren, do you want to add anything on that one?
Sure, I think it's a great question, and for folks who don't know, that part of South Minneapolis has already, what one could articulate as cumulative impacts light. So facilities in that part of South Minneapolis need to go through a cumulative levels and effects analysis, which that law does not have the same teeth as the new cumulative impact law that the legislature passed this year. So we are in the process of right now of going through the permitting process for Smith Foundry, which we're expecting in January or February of next year, 2024, of having that cumulative levels and effects analysis out for the public to review and provide feedback on, as well as a timeline permitting schedule too. But Stephen is, I think, exactly right. There's an opportunity here to, as the agency goes through the Smith Foundry permitting process, to use many of the things that are already currently in that statute for South Minneapolis, as well as looking for opportunities to use as a quote unquote test pilot for as we kind of implement the cumulative impacts law.
Thanks, Darren. I see a couple more suggestions. Basic education on cumulative impacts should be concurrent with the upcoming meeting sessions. I think that makes sense to me too. Amy asks, can you please clarify the cumulative impacts process and how the community benefit agreement may or may not be included or intersect with this process? Yeah, no, that's a super good question. This is something that we're hoping to put together a little graphic on at some point. But sort of the high level overview is you start with, do you need to do a cumulative impact analysis? If yes, then you have to do the analysis. You have to look at all of the parts of it. And then the next question is there or is there not a substantial adverse impact? If there is not, then that seems to be the end of the process. If there is a substantial adverse impact, that's where then the facility has to enter into that community benefit agreement. So that's where then now you have to look at this substantial adverse impact is happening or could happen. What does the next steps look like? What does that community benefit agreement cover? Does that end up doing, any of the things that we sort of summarized here that we heard in the comment section or from the comments was, do you look at reducing other local impacts? Do you look at reducing emissions to remove that substantial adverse impact? Do you look at doing something else? All of that is still TBD, but that's how you get to that community benefit agreement. So not every time you do a cumulative impact analysis, does that mean you necessarily will get to that community benefit agreement? Because that only happens when there is that substantial adverse impact. But once it does happen, just to point out, this is one of the really interesting areas of this legislation, is that if you have to have one of those community benefit agreements, the facility has to have one of those. And if they don't, then the agency has to deny that permit. So that's one of the parts of this legislation that puts some real teeth, like Darren was mentioning, it puts some teeth onto what has to happen moving forward. Because if you don't reach that community benefit agreement, then the project can't go forward. And the agency is directed by the legislature to not to deny that application. Betty asks, my meetings tend to be in the afternoon, morning or noontime meetings would be good. And then I saw another suggestion of specific education on health impacts of air pollution. And then I think, Amy, I think I saw you come off camera. Did you have a follow-up there for your question?
Yeah. So I'm still learning about all of this. I work for the St. Louis County Public Health Division up in the Duluth area, which St. Louis County goes all the way up to Ely, but we're talking about Duluth here. So currently, does the PCA do cumulative impact analyses for all their permitting processes in regards to these specific projects that we're talking about?
Not specifically. This is sort of what the legislature created here was a new, or they told us to create, is a new regulatory program that looks at the cumulative impacts. So we might look at, in the course of a permitting, reviewing a permit application, we might look at, what's the impact to ambient air. We have federal and state ambient air quality standards. We have to make sure that we're meeting those standards. We might do, if it's a larger project, it might go through environmental review, and you have to do a few more specific things as a part of environmental review. But those are all triggered under their own specific circumstances. And what this program is looking to do, or what the legislature told us to create, is we want to do a more specific look at what these impacts are from a variety of pollutants in an area, specifically environmental justice areas in the 7-county metro and Duluth and Rochester. So
Okay.
we have a lot of, I think, work that we do currently that we can also probably use as a good starting point for what we might look at in a cumulative impact analysis. But that's all TBD, that's what we're still trying to figure out how we go about doing it.
Okay, so the cumulative impact analyses, those are within the new current legislation as well as community benefit agreements?
Correct. Yep.
Okay. Thank you. I was thinking that the community benefit agreement was the new piece and that you have always been doing cumulative impact analyses, but you do some type of analyses for certain projects, but not these cumulative analyses, correct?
Correct. Yeah. What I like to think of this in my own head to help me make sense of it is we might do a whole bunch of things under a lot of different circumstances. And some things may only be required under a certain small subset of conditions, right? But what this is looking at, or what this legislation told the agency to do, is we want you to now also think about doing some of these things that you may be doing already, some new things that you may come up with under this circumstance. And so there's more specific, you must do this if XYZ happens.
Mm-hmm. Okay, great, thank you. And I appreciate this aspect. It's more about community and people than the environment, which I'm sure is also sort of new to you in PCA. So I really appreciate your leadership on this. Thank you. And thank you, Maggie, and others for doing some more clarifying in the chat.
Thanks, Amy. I think, Eric, I saw your hand go up. I saw a couple comments in the chat first, so I'll just address those real quick and then we'll go to you if that's all right. I saw Linda said, if the cumulative impact analysis indicates a substantial impact, shouldn't the industry permit be immediately denied? Great question. That's one of the things that I think we have to figure out as part of this process, because the way the legislation is written is that doesn't necessarily immediately become the outcome. It might be, well, And just to maybe as a way of an example, one question that we got earlier is in an earlier public meeting, somebody asked, is this rule only going to be used to, sort of deny industry, deny applications from going forward? What if I live in this small town and there's a industry that's coming in and they want to do something and that's going to bring jobs to my community that we care about, that I care about. So I think it's a really, and maybe that industry, maybe that facility leads to some impact, but maybe the community also wants them to be there for different reasons. So it's this really difficult balancing act of what's the impact, can they reduce? I think one outcome certainly could be to reduce it, so there isn't that substantial impact. But if that's not necessarily the only outcome, working with that community and working with people that live there, everybody is different. Everybody's going to have different focuses, different things that they want to have happen. So I think that's the really tricky part about this program, is how do we balance all of those different aspects, those different considerations that groups have. I think Eric, let's go to thanks for your patience. Go ahead with your question.
Yeah, my question is, after all this rule making, and we have the rules, so what next? And I asked that because how can this be really impactful to communities, not just their participation in the rule making, but also the impact of the rule making, they feel it in their communities. The difference between the MPCA and the legislature is that the legislature just write laws. You guys can write and enforce. So how can you assure that this is going to be enforced the way it's written, as well as are you going to ask the legislature for more resources? For what are you going to do to make sure that we are not just talking and making rules, but we see those rules being enforced? Is that going to be part of the process to make sure that this impacts community the way it's supposed to, or with the intention and spirit of the legislature?
No, thanks, Eric. That's a great question. So, and I'll maybe others from PCA jump in. You might have a better sense of sort of the resources that are specifically called out as part of this legislation that also created this rulemaking. But Eric, to your first question, what happens when we get to a final rule? A whole bunch of stuff. We have to figure out, well, how do we make this the implementation side of things? So now we have the rule. Maybe, if you think back to that petition process that a community might use, we'll have to create something that says, here's, maybe there's a form, or maybe there's some, specific thing that we have on our website that helps explain, the petition process and how to, get signatures, or what information you can include or should include, or that, options for information that you could include. All of that is, really dependent on what we end up doing with the rules, but that's a big part of kind of what we think about as we're thinking about the rules, what the draft rules might look like. We have to think about, how do we actually implement these going forward? And as far as the resources to then, kind of look at this, enforce this, and actually do that implementation, I don't know, maybe, I know there's a bunch of people from PCA on here, so I don't know if it's Darren or Anna or Carrie, if you have off the top of your head. I know the legislation included a bunch of funding, both for the rulemaking and I think for some additional staffing resources at the agency to manage this program eventually. Correct me if I'm wrong.
You are correct, sir.
All right. Aaron, any more details? Maggie, any more details you want to add for Eric?
Eric, I just wanted to say there is one piece of the legislation that says part of what we have to develop is, so the rules will take a couple of years to get to final, but then when we're actually processing permits through these rules in a couple of years, what is the process for public meetings and public comments around this process? So if there's a facility in your neighborhood, how will you be notified? How will they have to hold a meeting and take comments? And so I think to the extent that we want the process to be transparent and we want communities to be involved in the rulemaking and in the implementation of the final rules, that is one place that you can really help shape what are we required to do during that process, what are facilities required to do during that process, and what are the ways that communities can hold us to that once the rules are final, right? We have a compliance and enforcement role, absolutely. We're working with our compliance and enforcement staff, but there's also this chance to say, this doesn't just happen between the agency and the applicant, this has to happen sort of in sight of the community and with input from the community. So I think that's a place to think about providing comments, helping shape the final rules so that when we get to processing a permit, you understand how you can get involved. And if we aren't doing what we said we would do, how to raise that, because I think that that part's really important too.
I can perhaps add a little bit to that too. So I think one of the important pieces is the actual rule language and what the rule language says about implementation. And so with this rulemaking, we're writing a process or developing a process and triggers for facilities to need to undergo this additional review and those types of things. And so I think as we start having additional meetings where we're digging into more of the rule concepts specifically, those are the areas where we could really use some additional comments from folks and input in terms of, what that could look like, because we want to write a rule that can be implemented. It doesn't do us a lot of good if we're not able to transition the rule into requirements and permits or action on the ground and things like that. So certainly how we can write a process into rule that provides for, community input and things like that, it would be very, very beneficial. It looks like Deepa may have something to add too, Hassan.
Yeah, go for it, Deepa.
Yeah, sorry. I'm Deepa Diavis. I am the supervisor of air policy unit. So we do the rule writing and doing the technical analysis. But after all that is done, we also help the implementation, the transition from the rule writing to implementation. So that involves our enforcement and compliance and enforcement people, our air data analysis people, the modeling and risk assessment group. And if we need to develop new forms, we do that. And of course, the air permitting staff are also involved. So there is another whole group that will be formed afterwards, or as we are finishing the adaptation of the rules. And there will be a new position specifically hired in our unit to coordinate all that work. So rest assured, this is going to be very well implemented, and you can hold us accountable.
Thanks, Deepa. Just going through the chat real quick. It looks like a few folks added in some additional information surrounding environmental review. H. Michael. There can be environmental assessments or environmental impact statements. Those are some of the other analyses that the MPCA uses. Maggie added EAWs, that environmental assessment worksheet, and EISs, the environmental impact statement, also have cumulative impact analyses, but the Pollution Control Agency isn't always responsible for writing those. Absolutely. Rob added a handful. Wow, great. Thank you, Rob. A handful of folks to consider for webinars or conversations. Rob, I would, if you have their contact information and you wouldn't mind sending it to us, I'm sure I can find it. I can do my internet searches as well as the average bear, but if you have their contact information, that would be super helpful. And maybe that's in that link that you posted there, but I will check that out later.
Hassan,
Go ahead,
this
Anna.
is Anna. Again, I can perhaps add a little bit of information related to what's included in environmental review and perhaps how there's some similarities and some differences, if that would be helpful.
Sure. Yeah, why not?
Great. So hi again, everyone. Anna Hotz. I am the section manager of PCA's Community and Business Assistance section. And environmental review and rulemaking both fall within my section. So the comments that people made are correct, that environmental review does look at the potential for cumulative environmental effects that are presented by a project. But as one person pointed out, MPCA is not necessarily the entity responsible for conducting environmental review. Depends on what sector the project falls in, a handful of areas. We do several of them, but not always. We're certainly not always the one. Sometimes it's a local government, a city or a county. Sometimes it's another state agency. So there are lots of different options there. And then the other thing to note is not every project goes through environmental review. There are specific triggers that require environmental review. There are what are called mandatory categories, either for that environmental assessment worksheet or the environmental impact statement. And so while yes, we do look at that in environmental review, it's a fairly small portion of projects that actually go through environmental review. And some of these projects perhaps have been through environmental review prior to their initial permitting, but if they're coming back for reissuance of a permit or something like that, that's not going to trigger an environmental review unless they're doing some type of expansion. And that is on a case-by-case basis, depending on the nature of the expansion and things like that. So yes, I appreciate the note that environmental review does look at the potential for those cumulative effects, but certainly I don't think we can rely on that wholly to address these issues, because we would not be catching all the facilities.
Perfect. Thanks, Anna. So it looks like Janice Otts had suggested the MPCA describe the current process of what gets permits approved or denied and renewed as background information. I think that's, and how cumulative impacts will strengthen the process for protecting community and environmental health. I think those are some great suggestions for future. I believe you're suggesting for future webinars. If you're looking, let me know if you're asking for information now, but I'm reading it as a future webinar suggestion. I see Linda says this seems to weaken the ultimate strength of the legislation. I think tying back to the conversation surrounding substantial impact, adverse impact. Thank you, Todd. T. Bwin responded to Linda there. Eric, I'm excited about the accountability part too, and thanks, Rob, for looking into that. Let's see. I think, all right, we're mostly up to the current with the chat. David asks, can we use the same concept as CO2 emission tax and fees that's being implemented in the world? Some facilities who generate more pollution, they pay more fees or fines. Some facilities who generate less pay less. Yeah, I think we have a similar structure here for some types of pollutants. We do have an annual emissions inventory that facilities have to pay into, dependent on the amount of pollution that they generate. It's very specific to a handful of pollutants that we are able to charge for or able to establish fees for. But I think, again, that's an interesting suggestion. Good suggestion, David. That is all I'm seeing so far, and I can't remember, but I believe, are we going until 3? Was that the timing for, so like another 20 minutes? Or if anybody has any other questions, feel free, jump in. Darren, go ahead if you want to clarify.
Yeah, we could do maybe a last call for questions here today. I appreciate everyone staying on today and asking a lot of good, thorough questions and recommendations. Going back to Rob's recommendations. If others on today's call have thoughts over the next several weeks about organizations, people that would be extremely helpful for us, the agency, to bring in and be part of a conversation to help do some more grounding on what's working, what isn't working, thinking about folks that have gone through community benefit agreements previously, other states, if there are folks that would be helpful or organizations, please send those to Hassan, because we definitely want to get on top of that and figure out, get things scheduled here as pretty quickly as possible, knowing that January is coming up pretty darn quick. Sorry to break the news to folks. So maybe a last call for questions. If folks just want to raise their hand, if they have any last questions, otherwise we can wrap up.
Yes, so again, I put my email in the chat box there. That is my office phone number if you would like to call me, if that's preferred. You're more than welcome to. And again, I'll just quickly reiterate, if you would like us to talk to you, please let me know, because I don't need to hear myself talk any more than I already have. And I would love to hear what you all are thinking instead. All right, well, I think that looks like we're good. So I think I'll say thanks everybody for coming today. Glad, nice to see you all here. And I'm glad we had some good questions in the chat and in person. So we'll hope to see you next time. Send me an email, give me a call if you want to talk anytime. More than welcome to do so. I appreciate it. Thanks everybody.